When two worlds collide.
A first birthday divided by duty, distance, and the battle for a unified family. My wife, who is 30 years old, and I, a 36-year-old man, have now been married for 2 years and are blessed with a 1-year-old daughter.
A little over a year ago, my wife made the courageous decision to move across the world to Canada so that together we could begin building a stable life and nurturing a family. Her immediate family did not come with her. Her mother still lives overseas, and unfortunately she struggles with mental health issues that require my wife to remain in frequent, ongoing contact. In Canada, she has no siblings or extended relatives, only a few friends she speaks with occasionally, so almost all of her emotional support comes from me. Then, earlier this month, an urgent crisis arose. My mother-in-law's housing situation collapsed. She was suddenly informed she had to vacate her home by the end of June, and without immediate help, homelessness seemed inevitable. My wife, without a moment's hesitation, booked the earliest possible flight and headed overseas to assist her mother in finding somewhere stable to live. The timing, however, was painful. This crisis coincided exactly with our daughter's first birthday, a milestone my wife desperately wanted to share. Once my wife departed, our 1-year-old daughter and I moved into my mother's home, where my mother and stepfather kindly offered to care for her while I continued working remotely. Fortunately, my job allows me to be nearby even while working from home, so I could balance both responsibilities. Despite the distance, my wife has made a point of calling every day via WhatsApp video so she can see and speak to our daughter, even if our toddler mostly responds with giggles and babbling. These calls have become a lifeline for her. During some of these video calls, my mom tried to entertain our daughter, singing songs and showing her toys, to help my wife feel included. But rather than making things easier, her animated interventions were overwhelming. Every time my mom stepped in, she stole focus from my wife's efforts to connect. So I gently asked her to keep things calmer during video chats. Unexpectedly, that request offended her. Beyond that gentle tension, though, my mom and stepdad have been invaluable, stepping up in loving ways that have kept our household running smoothly. However, as the weeks went by, I found myself increasingly irritated by my mother and grandmother's outdated Soviet-era parenting advice. They would offer me suggestions that I could only describe as borderline abusive. One evening, for instance, my grandmother insisted that I keep our teething 10-month-old awake throughout the day, deprived of naps, so she would sleep soundly at night. I flatly refused. As soon as I did, my grandmother leaned over and, in hushed tones, began telling my mother how they, her generation, had decades of collective wisdom in raising children. Not including me in that conversation was infuriating. It was as though I were invisible, and I felt my blood boil at the assumption that their approach was superior to mine. Meanwhile, living in my mother's house, our daughter's vegetarian diet became another battleground. My wife and I are vegetarian, and we had already devised a well-balanced meal plan, carefully including protein, iron, fats, vitamins, approved by our family doctor. To my shock, my mother repeatedly suggested we surreptitiously feed our daughter meat without telling my wife. She believed it was healthier and simply didn't want to have the discussion with my wife. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I warned her bluntly, if you do that, she'll never speak to you again. And then there was the birthday itself. For days before the celebration, my mom and sister pressed me about our plans, asking what we would do, how we'd celebrate. I had told them plainly that we weren't planning anything, not while the mother of our child was out of town. Still, on the morning of my daughter's birthday, my mother, stepfather, grandmother, and sister showed up at our door bearing gifts. I was working, but I didn't think much of the toys, they'd just become part of the growing pile of presents anyway. That was until I saw my sister carrying in a cake, adorned with candles. At that moment, I knew I had to draw the line. I told my sister firmly, we are not lighting that candle, we are not cutting the cake, and we are not celebrating today without my wife present. My sister immediately argued, framing it as being about our daughter and family, not about me. But I knew the difference, bringing the cake, lighting candles, entertaining guests, it all felt like staging a birthday party in my wife's absence. I reiterated, no party without my wife. My mom and sister tried to convince me it wasn't really a party, just a simple cake moment, but it checked every box: people, gifts, cake, candles. It looked like a birthday party, plain and simple. My sister even tried to pull rank as aunt and called me a douchebag for refusing. That unleashed me entirely. In front of our daughter and the family, I lost my temper. The shouting match that ensued, with my sister trying to force the issue and me trying to hold firm, was awful, especially given our daughter's presence. Eventually, my stepfather intervened, telling us both to step outside until we cooled down. 30 minutes apart gave us a chance to calm down, but the damage was already done. Later that evening, my mother tried again, first to reason with me, then to change the subject back to our daughter's diet, pushing once more to feed her meat behind my wife's back. Then the conversation turned personal. Without provocation, she launched into criticisms of my wife. My wife, a devoted stay-at-home mother, had, before pregnancy, completed her undergraduate degree but struggled to find work in a new country. She is isolated here, all her family overseas, and starting over. I have tried to support her as she figures out her path, whether it's further study, a meaningful job, or exploring new opportunities, but my mother declared her an unemployed child who doesn't value money, effectively attacking her character. My mother tried to brush it off with a hug. When she pulled me into an embrace, I recoiled, not because I wanted to be hateful but because her behavior was painful, dismissive, and insensitive. She minimized the entire situation, dismissing both of us as too sensitive. In her mind, there was nothing wrong with barging in and undermining both my wife and me. She believed we were making mountains out of molehills. All this has forced a reckoning. My wife has confided in me that she feels disliked by my mother, and though I used to write it off as language barriers or cultural differences, at this point the weight of their actions and words is impossible to ignore. I am now convinced, my mom harbors a strong disdain for my wife. And I am left seething, not just for how my wife has been treated, but also for how our marriage and our parenting are being continually disrespected. In 2 short weeks, an already delicate situation has fractured into something ugly. The birthday drama, the unsolicited, undermining advice, the accusations, all of it has made me furious at how we are being treated. Yet it has also made me determined. We will protect our family, our values, and our unity against criticism, no matter how well-intentioned it may seem to my mother and grandmother. My wife was still abroad, handling her mother's urgent housing crisis. She had sent me a message overnight, short, laced with sorrow and exhaustion. She had finally found a temporary place to stay, but it wasn't ideal, cramped, expensive, lacking privacy, nowhere near permanent. She thanked me for holding down the home front, for standing up to my family. Yet beneath her words I sensed fatigue, perhaps even dread. I feel like I'm failing both my mother and my own family. That weighed on me. I wondered if my stand had done more harm than good, leaving her torn between 2 crises and carrying guilt she did not deserve. I washed my face, attempted some meditation, and made a quiet resolve. I would call my wife as soon as the morning light allowed, to share my support and clarity before the days became more complicated. By mid-morning, I was back at my mother's house, where the air still felt thick from the lingering arguments. My mom offered breakfast, and I declined with perfunctory courtesy. She nodded, perhaps in relief. My grandmother and sister were already there, furtively avoiding my gaze. It felt like living in a paused reality, where time marched on outside but inside we were stuck in the echoes of anger. I dreaded the small talk. Work kept me glued to the screen. Emails, video meetings, reports, it all blurred. But my attention kept shattering in fragments each time my thoughts drifted to my wife or daughter. I wondered how my wife was coping in a foreign city, bridging caretaking for her mother with excruciating homesickness. I wondered how my daughter was. Had she noticed the absence of her mother? Was she fussier, clingier? I daydreamed about bringing my wife home, about setting foot in the front door and seeing her face light up when she saw our daughter's joy. That thought gave me a momentary spark of peace. Near lunchtime, my phone buzzed, a WhatsApp video call from my wife. I quietly slipped out of the office room and answered. Her face filled the screen, tired eyes, a soft smile. She held up our daughter in her arms, from a small apartment halfway across the world. Our daughter babbled, reached toward the camera, as if she could feel her mother's love through the screen. As I watched, I felt an ache, one so deep I could barely speak. My wife whispered, "I miss her so much." We talked for 10 minutes about small things, what our daughter ate, a funny thing she did during her walk, the cake saga, but every word carried an undertone of longing. My wife told me she was exploring daycare options near her mother's new place, tentatively planning a few classes in English conversation so she could start rebuilding her own life there. I encouraged her, we would make it work. We reminded each other, this separation is temporary, but our unity remains. When she ended the call, I realized how essential these daily connections are, glimpses across time zones that sustain us through chaos. That afternoon, the matter of lunch escalated my anxiety. My mother appeared in the doorway, unannounced, carrying a small plate. It held a thick slice of roast pork, rice, and vegetables, our daughter's midday meal. My heart sank. I had asked her not to introduce meat into our child's diet, not without discussion, and she was now holding chicken in her hands. I refused firmly, "Please take that away. Our daughter won't eat it." My mother's face fell, lips pressed in a tight line. I added, "We are not hiding it. We won't pretend she's vegetarian when she's not." That simple statement, speaking our truth, suddenly put a chasm between us. She sighed, moved without a word, and left the room. I knew this confrontation would echo through the rest of the afternoon. The rest of the day dragged. I tried to focus, but feelings of guilt crept in, guilt that I had hurt my mother's feelings, guilt that my wife was suffering abroad, guilt at failing to create a birthday celebration for our daughter. By late afternoon, I shut my laptop and stood from my chair. I needed fresh air. I took our daughter in her stroller and walked to a nearby park. The sun was gentle, the breeze teasing the leaves overhead. Children laughed in the distance, parents played on swings. Under the open sky, with my daughter reaching for a dandelion, I let my heart calm. I allowed myself to lean into gratitude, for this daughter, for this life, for the privilege of being her father. On the walk home, I called my wife again. She answered immediately, excitement lighting her features. We took turns describing the playground, the laughter, the warmth. For a few moments, we were no longer thousands of miles apart, we were simply a family having a good day. But we couldn't linger. She had a dinner to prepare for her mother, I had to return to reports. We said goodnight with promises, just 10 more days. And I love you. The evening brought another round of tension. My grandmother quietly approached me in the living room. She spoke softly, apologizing for pushing the sleep and diet advice. She said her generation held fast to old traditions, and she knew maybe they didn't fit now. Her words were gentle, and I realized that beneath the stubborn exterior was a desire to belong, to help, even if misguided. I thanked her for understanding. She nodded, and something shifted. Respect began to rebuild. Later that night, pain found me in the quiet of my bedroom. I replayed the birthday explosions, the cruel words hurled at my wife, the guilt that came each time I thought of my mother angry with me. I wrote a long message to my mom and sister, an explanation of why I drew boundaries, why I valued partnership and transparency, why I refused to celebrate a milestone without the mother of our child. I asked for their understanding and apologized if I had hurt them, but I stood firm, we needed respect. I hit send, and let the words stay where they landed. I then gathered photos from our daughter's birthday morning, the toys, the half-blown candles, our empty living room. I sent them to my wife, who responded with tears and her emoji smile. We messaged back and forth for hours, love, longing, grief, determination. The photos became a catalyst for ideas. We drafted plans to throw a birthday reunion when she returned, nothing grand, just the four of us, at home. We imagined decorations, songs, a small cake. We both felt hopeful. When my wife went to sleep, I lay awake thinking. Fear gripped me, not fear of conflict but of complacency. The confrontation had jolted me awake to deep truths, that family bonds do not require blind compliance, that protecting our marriage and parenting decisions was more important than avoiding offense, that love needed firm boundaries to survive. I resolved, on my wife's return, we would call a family meeting, my mom, my stepfather, perhaps even my grandmother. We would express our appreciation, explain our decisions, and ask for space and respect. I knew they might bristle. But I also knew, this life we're building, a mix of cultures, values, sacrifices, needed a foundation of trust and open dialogue. We couldn't keep treading softly, afraid of tearing the old fabric of family, we had to weave it anew. The next morning, I woke early, with resolve still strong. I dressed, changed my daughter's onesie, and made her milk. My mother greeted me with cautious eyes. She handed over our daughter and offered tea. I smiled, the silence between us felt lighter. We sat in the warmth of the kitchen. I knew words would come soon. We both sensed it. And for the first time since the birthday, I felt ready to speak them, tentatively, but with conviction. The sun had barely risen, but a determined resolve stirred within me. This was the day we would initiate the conversation, one that could redefine our family's future, the long-awaited family meeting, to be held later that afternoon, once my wife returned from overseas. Preparing the space felt symbolic. I chose our living room, a space that had borne witness to both celebrations and conflicts. I moved furniture into an open circle formation to convey inclusion and warmth. I dusted the coffee table clean, replaced dishes with a vase of fresh flowers, white lilies and baby's breath, symbols of renewal and hope. I paused, placing a framed photo of our daughter smiling on her first birthday, her joy the fulcrum around which everything else balanced. In the morning light, I sat on the sofa, cups of tea in hand, rehearsing in my head the words I would say. I thought of my wife and how, despite her weariness, she had shown remarkable grace. She had navigated 2 homes, long-distance parenting, and a mother whose needs often overshadowed her own. I reminded myself that this meeting wasn't about blame, it was about understanding, mutual respect, and forging a path forward where love did not erode into resentment. Midday arrived, and with it a quiet sense of expectancy. My mother hovered in the kitchen, preparing lunch, her movements polite but stiff. My stepfather sat reading silently in his chair, a calm presence who often played the peacemaking role. My grandmother polished knobs and tidied cushions. My sister flitted about, occasionally pausing where our eyes briefly met before she looked away. There was an electric stillness in the room, each of us waiting for the moment when real conversation would begin. As planned, I stepped outside to meet my wife at the door when she arrived, suitcase in hand. She looked exhausted and worn, but as her eyes fell on our daughter, giggling in my arms, her face softened into that bright, luminous expression that had first drawn me to her. We embraced, a quiet, heartfelt reunion. I saw relief in her eyes, tempered by sadness at what had been lost during these 2 weeks apart. I whispered to her that everything would be okay, that this meeting would help put everything back together. After hugs and hellos to my family, we settled into the living room circle. I invited my wife to sit beside me, close but supportive. I began, voice steady but sincere, "Thank you all for being here. We love you, your support means everything. But these past weeks have been hard. We feel frustrated, unheard, and we need to share why. This isn't about blame, but about how we move forward, together." I recounted the birthday incident, the toys, yes, but also the cake, the candles, the guests, the decision to proceed without informing my wife. I expressed how that night had felt like a betrayal, like our family unity had been exploited in her absence. I described the arguments, the shouting, the pain evident on our daughter's face, and most distressingly, the labels my mother had used to describe my wife. I kept my voice calm, though emotion trembled beneath. I emphasized that I understood the intentions may have been well-meaning, but the effects were damaging. My mother's expression hardened. My grandmother looked away, sorrow etched on her face. My sister's lips thinned, but she sat quietly. I felt my wife's hand slip into mine and gave it a gentle squeeze before continuing. I spoke next about parenting values, how we had crafted our child's dietary plan with care, how we believed in nurturing rather than overriding, how trust, between husband, wife, parents and grandparents, is the bedrock of healthy family bonds. I admitted that by setting boundaries with my mother and grandmother, I wasn't rejecting them, but rather protecting a life we all love, born of both our cultures but moving toward shared values. Then I turned to my wife, inviting her to share her experience, how being away had hurt, how the birthday felt empty without her, how the pressure to please her mother had added emotional weight. And as she spoke, I glimpsed a shift in my family. My mother's brow creased, my grandmother's hands rested still in her lap, even my sister swallowed, her gaze no longer defiant. When my wife finished, a fragile silence followed. The air seemed both heavy and light, heavy with reckoning, light with possibility. I opened the floor gently. "How do you feel? What do you need from us?" My mother started, voice low. "I'm sorry," she said after a quiet moment. "I thought I was helping. I didn't know I caused so much pain." Her eyes glistened, and in that moment I saw regret, not defensiveness. My grandmother added, "Our ways are old, but your ways, they are your own. We need to accept that." My sister's face turned pink, but she spoke too. "I'm really sorry, brother. I didn't listen." The words were halting, but real. Then came a small, hopeful plan. We decided on clear boundaries, no major celebrations, dietary choices, sleep routines or medical decisions without mutual discussion. If grandparents wanted to give advice, they must offer it as suggestions, not instructions. Parents' decisions needed respect, even if they seemed strange or unfamiliar. And for communication, when any of us felt hurt by something, we would speak up promptly, respectfully, without threatening exclusion or blame. It was the first time we had actually forged a set of principles, a framework, to guide our blended family. We all agreed to start with little actions. My grandmother offered to learn more about vegetarian meals she could cook when she cared for our daughter. My sister promised to ask first before planning anything for our child. My mother committed to support our dietary choices, or at least ask questions before acting. Afterward we sat down to a modest tea time, sharing cake we'd baked together earlier, this time, a small vanilla sponge with fresh fruit, neither elaborate nor hidden. We lit a single candle together, my wife and I in the front. I saw tears in my wife's eyes, the ache had lifted. My mother wiped a loose strand from her hair, smiling. It was not extravagant, but it was healing. My daughter, now peaceful, napped in her playpen while we spoke softly in the adjacent room. At last, the tension had eased. We hadn't erased the past, but we had written the first lines of a new understanding. In these quiet moments, anticipation bloomed in me, a belief that the love we share could adapt, expand, and heal. We were still a work in progress. But for the first time, I felt the promise of unity, not from perfect adherence, but from honest, imperfect effort. And I realized that family, at its best, is not static. It evolves through conflict, emerges stronger through honest talk, and finds its heartbeat not in sameness, but in respect. Chapter 3 ends, not with resolution, but with renewal, a fragile, beautiful beginning.